Well, where are we now? What do we have in Hume's universe? We have a bundle of impressions or experiences, images, and so on. Impressions of what? Nothing. External world is a myth. Experiences experienced by whom? Nobody. The self is a myth. Now you might think this is as far as we can go in skepticism. Impressions of nothing by nobody. But there is more to go yet. There's one very famous and incredibly influential point of Hume's that is almost universally accepted today by philosophers. There is still one more link tying the world or tying experiences together, which must be shattered if we're to end up with a real poached egg mentality. And that is the law of cause and effect. Remember, Berkeley had believed in cause and effect coming from God. Hobbes had believed in cause and effect. Every major philosopher prior to Hume believed in cause and effect. Hume now sets his nominalism and sensualism to work to demolish cause and effect too. So now we'll look at Hume's greatest, quote, achievement, his destruction of the law of cause and effect. Well, again, we follow the standard procedure. Let's take the term cause. What does it mean? We say A causes B. Take a classic simple example. We take a rock and throw it at a window. The window shatters. We say the rock caused the window to break. What does it mean to say one thing caused another? Well, says Hume, people think that there are 3 points involved. 2 of them, as we'll see, are okay. One, the vital one, proves to be meaningless. Well, one thing involved in the causal relationship is spatial contiguity, togetherness in space. The rock actually touches the window, for instance, in the process of it breaking. Well, that's very simple. We can see the 2 of them in direct physical contact, so we have a direct perceptual referent for the phrase spatial contiguity or spatial togetherness, and therefore that's perfectly meaningful. But that, of course, is not enough. Causal relationship also involves temporal contiguity. The window breaks immediately after, in time, the rock strikes. And again, says Hume, that's a perfectly respectable phrase, temporal contiguity, because we can observe one thing happening immediately after another in time, and therefore that is perfectly meaningful. But spatial and temporal contiguity, after all, do not yet give us the essence of the causal relationship. A coincidence can have these 2 characteristics. For instance, suppose I casually touch this lectern, and while I'm in direct contact with it spatially, at the next instant, it suddenly gives off, I don't know, 13 bombs, and the whole room and whole building come down. Well, you would say, maybe the 2 events were spatially and temporally connected, but that simply is a coincidence. There's no causal connection. Maybe someone in the next room let off a bomb at the same instant. What is the crucial factor, the vital ingredient in the concept of causal connection? Well, says Hume, it is necessary connection. Not only spatial and temporal contiguity, but necessary connection. When we say A causes B, we mean more than simply the 2 go together in space and the 2 go together in time. We mean that the first necessitates the second, that the 2 have a compulsory connection to each other, that granted the first, the second must happen, that the first produces the second, that the first makes the second happen, etc. All those being synonyms for necessary connection. Well, now let us put this strand, necessary connection, to the test of the theory of meaning. Do we ever perceive or form an image of necessary connection between events? Now watch it very closely. I don't have a window here to demonstrate. But you just have to project that. I'd take a rock and I throw it at the window, and you see the rock sailing slowly across the room. Then you see, now you can stand there, you right next to the wall with a magnifying glass to watch. You see the rock moving, touch the window. So far there's no necessity, there's just a rock, right? The next thing you see the fragment shatter, right? Now, no little flag came out and said, the next event is unavoidable. There was no booming voice from the sky that said, what comes now has to be. There was no Doris Day saying, que sera, sera. We perceive the two events go together in space and time, that's all. We never come in contact with any such phenomenon as necessity. What is necessity like? Is it red? Is it loud? Is it hot? Well, can you form an image of it? What does it look like? What would it taste like? Obviously, we cannot form a percept of necessity. We cannot form an image of necessity. It must therefore be an utterly meaningless term. The phrase necessary connection must be just noise, like gloop. And so, of course, must any of its synonyms. A synonym of nonsense is nonsense. And therefore, when you say one thing produces another, or makes it happen, or given the first, the second must happen, all of those are equally meaningless. Now let's have Hume speak for himself on this. Quote, first, he states his nominalism and sensualism. Quote, it seems a proposition which will not admit of much dispute that all our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions. That's his sensualism. You see, an idea is simply a faded copy of your sense experience. To be fully, I'm continuing the quote, to be fully acquainted, therefore, with the idea of necessary connection, let us examine its impression. And in order to find the impression with greater certainty, let us search for it in all the sources from which it may possibly be derived. Now, unquote. Now he conducts a scrupulous search all over the place, looking for necessary connection if only he could find it. And I quote, when we look about us towards external objects and consider the operation of causes, we are never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection. Any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. We only find that the one does actually, in fact, follow the other. There is not in any single particular instance of cause and effect anything which can suggest the idea of necessary connection. Unquote. Well, if an idea is a name for a fading experience, a copy of an experience, and there is no experience of necessary connection, there is no idea of necessary connection, the phrase must be meaningless. When, therefore, you take a knife and put it in somebody's heart and twist it, one event is observing the knife go in, and the next event is you see the man turn pale and lie down on the ground. And those are two events that are spatially and temporally contiguous, and that's it. You cannot say one made the other happen. All you have a right to assert, in fact, the only thing that is meaningful to assert, is that the two events go together in space and time. You observe that one is right next to the other, that one is right after the other, but you can't observe that one is because of the other. And of course, that's right, you can't observe the causality. Well, why do you think that there is a necessary relationship, if in fact this is a myth? Again, because you have an overactive imagination. In this case, you have a hyperactive associative mechanism. Two events, which in fact have no necessary connection, or if it would be meaningless to say so. Two events happen by chance to go together so many times in your experience that after a while you form the habit, simply by custom, by conditioning, to expect the second when you encounter the first. That is the source of the irrational idea of necessary connection. You observe, says Hume, repeated conjunctions, two events which happen to go together repeatedly. And you begin to associate the two and expect the second after the first. For instance, suppose you were brought up by an irrational mother. And for no reason at all, every morning when you sat down at breakfast to drink a glass of orange juice, just as you picked the glass of orange juice up, she had a huge strap and she smashed the kitchen table with it. Now, and this happened day after day. There's no causal connection, but that's just the kind of mother you have. After a while, as you pick up the orange juice, you flinch in the expectation of the strap, and you come to associate the two, you see, simply by quantity of repetition. Well, Hume says this is exactly the relationship in every case where we assert cause and effect. That's not his example. Causality is simply a subjective expectation on our part, completely irrational without any justification. You can use the word cause if you want, but then all it means is two events are repeatedly conjoined up to now in our experience, and we therefore have the accompanying irrational, baseless expectation that there's some connection between them. But in fact, there is no connection. I think I have one more quote from Hume on this. Quote, a famous conclusion. All events seem entirely loose and separate. Loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. And as we have no idea of anything which never appeared to our senses, the conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of connection at all, and that this word is absolutely without any meaning when employed either in philosophical reasoning or common life, unquote. That's uncompromising Humean statement. Now, suppose you contest this and say, oh, that's ridiculous. Causality is not simply a matter of habit. Causal sequences are necessary. Their opposites are literally inconceivable. We couldn't even imagine their opposites happening. Hume comes back with a famous example. He says you can perfectly well imagine the opposite happening. He gives the example of Adam. Of course, he doesn't believe in Adam, doesn't believe in anything, but it is just as an example of the first man. Now, Adam across the garden sees a flame. Is Adam able to know before he experiences the behavior of the flame that the flame is going to consume him if he puts his hand into it? No, he says. Adam hasn't the faintest idea how this orange tongue that's flickering is going to behave when he puts his hand into it. Prior to experience, if we asked Adam, is it going to make you 6 feet taller, burn your hand off, or turn you into a pumpkin, Adam would say, I haven't a clue. Well, says Hume, what has he got after experience? After experience, he's got a burned hand. But he doesn't have any more understanding of why this took place. As far as he can see, the fire could just as well have turned him into ice or into a pumpkin. In other words, it simply is a matter of brute fact that it happens to be the case that fire up to now burns or warms. But it's unintelligible why this is so, and we can easily conceive the opposite. Now, if someone were to say that we can explain by reference to scientific law why fire does what it does, Hume would say, scientific law? Scientific law is based on cause and effect. Cause and effect depends on necessary connection, and that's meaningless. So much for scientific laws. All we do is we let our familiarity with certain arbitrary sequences delude us into thinking that the connection is intelligible, when actually it's completely unintelligible. Well, suppose you tried to give Hume a proof in logic that every event must have a cause that necessitates it. Well, Hume says, go ahead and try. And I'll show you that you can't give me any such proof. Is your proof going to rely on reason, he says. You answer, well, certainly, I'm going to give a rational proof. Well, says Hume, by reason we can only prove truths whose opposites would be contradictory, logical contradictions. Reason teaches us that we have to believe something because the opposite would be a contradiction. So we can prove that 2 and 2 is 4 because if somebody denied it, we could show him he was contradicting himself. Now, anything which is a contradiction is inconceivable. You can't conceive a round square, for instance, because the two sides annihilate each other. Now, is there any difficulty in conceiving that the law of cause and effect is false? Would any contradiction be involved, he asks, in conceiving it? No. The opposite of the law of cause and effect, he says, is perfectly conceivable. It's easy to understand. It's not like a round square which obliterates it itself. It's perfectly conceivable. Take the idea, there are events which don't have any causes. Now, if this was a contradiction, we shouldn't even be able to grasp it. It should be like married bachelor. But, says Hume, there's no difficulty in grasping this. Just imagine, I'm making up the example, but this is his idea. Imagine you're walking down the street, and suddenly an apple pops into existence out of thin air. Nothing preceded it. It's not a hallucination. It just is there without any cause. Walt Disney could draw it. Now, says Hume, this is perfectly conceivable. There's no contradiction in it. If there were a contradiction, you couldn't conceive it, but you understood my story, so you must be able to conceive it. Whereas if I said a round square popped out, you'd say, I don't know what that is. If it's conceivable, there's no contradiction. If there's no contradiction, reason can't prove it. Reason only proves something whose opposite is a contradiction. Therefore, the law of cause and effect cannot be proved. Since it can't be proved in reason, and we know there's no basis for it in reference to experience, we conclude the law of cause and effect is bereft of any foundation of any kind in reason or in experience. It is therefore simply a myth. Now, of course, the objections to this Humean viewpoint are legion. Since this is the last time I'll get my licks in at Hume, I keep interrupting each point because I can't put it off anymore, the course running out. But let me just indicate briefly. Notice that Hume assumes that if he can visualize an event that takes place allegedly without a cause, that's the same as saying he conceives it without contradiction. Now, of course, if Aristotle heard this argument, he would say, you are visualizing an event which implies a contradiction. And therefore, you are actually conceiving nothing but an irrational figment of your own imagination. You have an image, but not a logical concept. What would Hume's answer be if he heard that? What's the difference? An image is a concept. If I can form an image of something, I've formed a concept of it. That, of course, is his nominalism. Concept is an image. So if you can form an image, you can form a concept. And if you can form a concept, then it's obviously logically possible. Therefore, if you can form an image, any arbitrary, fantastic image, the thing it stands for is logically possible. That is the end result of reducing concepts to images the way the nominalists do. Now, you might think you would satisfy Hume if you gave him the proof of cause and effect that we developed from Aristotle's philosophy. You remember the argument which had essentially two premises. Actions are actions of entities, and entities have identity. They are what they are, the law of identity, and therefore, to make a long story short, they can only act in accordance with their nature. Now, if you were to reincarnate David Hume and give him this argument, he wouldn't bat an eye or turn a hair. Because observe each premise. Entities. He would say, what is that? All we have are loose floating bundles of qualities. And that's all that he as a nominal essentialist can encounter. And therefore the premise about entities existing is already out. And so is therefore the base of any proof of cause and effect given his nominalism. And as for the law of identity, is that supposed to be a necessary general truth? Well then, as a nominalist, that of course must be linguistic, semantic, just the way you use words. It doesn't say anything. Now you see, in other words, causality already comes fairly far down in philosophy. You first of all have to have the conceptual level to validate your knowledge of anything, including of causality. So there's actually nothing new to answer in Hume's attack on cause and effect. If you can answer his nominalism and sensualism, if you can defend a valid theory of concepts, then his whole attack on cause and effect crashes to the ground along with the whole rest of his philosophy. And of course, if you cannot answer his nominalism and sensualism, then you are lost and everything is lost. And you see again the crucial importance of a valid theory of concepts. In any event, for Hume, the collapse of cause and effect leads to overwhelming, insoluble problems. It leads him to complete and total skepticism. Because if there is no cause and effect, how can we predict the future? How can we generalize? How can we say that because things have happened a certain way in the past, therefore they will happen that way in the future? How can we ever formulate scientific laws? How can we even have science? To all of which Hume's answer is, you can't. We have, he says, no reason on earth to assume that nature follows law. We have no reason to assume that nature is uniform. We have no reason to assume that the future will be like the past. This is known as the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is, what makes you think that because something has happened a certain way repeatedly in the past, it will therefore happen that way in the future? Now, of course, if there are necessary connections in reality, if there are actual laws which nature must obey, then you can validly generalize from experience under the appropriate circumstances. But if you destroy causality and you reduce it, nature, to simply unintelligible, brute conjunction of events without any necessity, then anything is possible at the next instant. And the fact that something has happened 1,000 times proves nothing about the future. It's simply been a run of coincidence. Now, people often misunderstand Hume. And they think he is saying, well, you can never be certain about the future. You can only have a degree of probability. He goes much beyond that. He says you can't even have the faintest trace of probability with regard to the future. Every occurrence is a brand new event. All events are loose and separate. There is no necessity about any conjunction of events. And therefore you haven't the slightest reason, he says, to assume that the future will resemble the past in any respect. If I throw a penny up in the air, now up to now, the penny has come down. And you might be inclined to say, well, there's a good chance it'll come down again. But of course, in Hume's philosophy, there's only one chance in infinity that it will come down. It might just stand still. It might go straight up. It might turn into Hegel. It might become a quarter. It could do anything. Now you say, but it's come down so many times in the past. Well, I've heard Humeans say that just goes to show that we have had such a run of good luck that we shouldn't expect it to continue. That's known as the problem of induction. Well, we've reached a total dead end, an absolutely shattered universe. We have loosely floating qualities, no entities, no reality, no self, no causality, everything a brute contingent fact. Now let's mop up some final points. Is there any necessary knowledge, according to Hume? anything we can know as necessary. Yes, he says, but not matters of fact. Not matters of fact. Anything which talks about the way things actually are, any factual statement, is contingent. We derive it from experience. It is empirical. A posteriori, using the term I introduced last time, which means dependent on experience. Well, then where do we get necessary knowledge of? Only in what Hume calls relations of ideas. If I utter the statement, bachelors are male, I can know that that has to be true. Because, says Hume, it is a matter of definition. I define bachelor as an entity, one of whose characteristics is being male. And therefore, this is a necessary truth. I can count on it. But it doesn't tell me anything about facts. It would be true even if there are no bachelors. It's necessary simply because we make it so by our arbitrary, nominalistic definitions. If it stated an actual fact of reality, he would say, how would you ever know it is necessary? Therefore, this kind of truth, the so-called relations of ideas, we arrive at by reason or thought or analysis. In their case, the opposite would be a contradiction. They are learned by definition, not by experience. They are so-called a priori. And so we have the standard dichotomy that we have seen in so many different forms as it exists in Hume, the linguistic truths versus the existential or factual truths, the logical truths versus the factual truths, the truths of reason, which are necessary but detached from reality, and the truths of experience, which pertain to fact but are contingent. You see, this is a variant of the standard dichotomy, and this is what Kant then picked up and called the analytic, the truths versus the synthetic. The analytic being the ones you arrive at by analysis, the logical truths so-called, and the synthetic being the ones that tell you actual empirical information. Now, given this, which is therefore not original with Hume, what happens to metaphysics if you accept this dichotomy of the necessary relations of ideas which are linguistic versus the contingent, factual, empirical truths? Well, is metaphysics supposed to be factual? Well, the advocates of metaphysics say certainly. Metaphysics tells you facts about reality. Well, if it's factual, it has to be empirical. Is metaphysics supposed to therefore tell you simply contingent empirical hypotheses? No, the advocates of metaphysical principles, like cause and effect, for instance, say they are necessary. Well, there's no such possibility as a factual necessary truth. If it's necessary, it's simply linguistic. If it's factual, it is not necessary. Is metaphysics supposed to be linguistic? No, say its advocates. Is metaphysics supposed to be contingent then? No, say its advocates. Well then, says Hume, metaphysics as such is out. Into the fire with it. There is no room for any such subject. If you come and say to Hume, but what about existence exists? A is A. Consciousness is the faculty for perceiving reality. Every event has a cause. He would say to you, do you mean those propositions as expression of your arbitrary linguistic usage? You would say, certainly not. I mean those to be facts of reality. He would say, did you arrive at them by sensory perception, and do you regard them as simply contingent truths? You say, certainly not. Those are laws and principles of reality. Say, no such category. It's either a subjective relation of ideas, or it is a brute contingent sensualist type fact. Therefore, as far as metaphysics is concerned, throw it into the fire. A viewpoint echoed in the 20th century by many schools who are simply neo-Humean. The upshot in Hume's viewpoint is this: if you are certain about a proposition if you understand why it must be true, if it's really reliable, it's detached from reality. And on the other hand, if it has something to say about the real world, you can't be certain about it and you can't make any sense of it. If you know it must be true, then it's not about the world. It says nothing about facts, it just expresses linguistic conventions. If it says something about facts, then it is contingent, uncertain, unreliable. If you prove it by experience, it's contingent and unreliable. If you prove it by logic, it simply is an arbitrary convention. So you're trapped either way. You cannot win. You end up in a complete skepticism. Now let us look briefly at some final topics from Hume, which we can race through briefly because the essence of his philosophy you now know. Hume on God. Well, of course, God cannot survive on a Humean philosophy. God is supposed to be a spiritual substance who is the cause of the world. Well, every item in that statement is gone. There is no world, no spiritual substance, and no causality. And consequently, God is out. And Hume takes great delight in demolishing God. He's particularly interested in the argument from design. You know, the Reader's Digest teleological argument. And he loves to take on religious people and make mincemeat of their viewpoint. Now, there are passages in Hume which indicate that religion is still a sensitive subject in his opinion and that he is loath to come out as a complete atheist, but obviously any belief in God would be completely incompatible with his philosophy. In essence, his view would be that God, as a term, is radically different from anything a sensualist can come in contact with, and therefore it's simply a meaningless noise. And therefore Hume is essentially anti-religious. If you read his detailed arguments, I may say you would find them a mixture of astute objections. He's a fairly good polemicist, but he's always a Humean, and to untangle his good objections from his crazy Humeanism, which are all mashed together, it's easier to refute God on your own without help from Hume. The effects of Hume's assault on God were that, combined with other influences, he was only one, but he contributed heavily to the fact that after this period, no influential philosopher again attempted to prove the existence of God in reason. Kant was very religious, but he did not think you could prove God in reason. Hegel, well, Hegel is Hegel, and his God is hardly the same as anybody else's God. Nietzsche said correctly in the 19th century, God is dead, meaning religion was a dead issue. And in the 20th century, one whole school derivative from Hume and Kant says that God is simply a noise, like gloop. It stands for nothing at all. And another school says that if you do believe in God, you have to go by absurd feelings because God is not graspable by reason. So God never survived the 18th century, philosophically. He never again had the importance that he did in Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley. Now there are people who think that this is good and that Hume has done a great service, combined with a few other philosophers, in getting rid of God. I would not agree with that. Because as an objectivist, I would say the concept of God is bad because it is anti-reason and anti-reality. But in Hume, God is thrown out along with reason and reality on the same grounds. And this is a very, very bad mixture. Now, I remember once talking to a brash sophomore. This was 20 years ago. And I asked him if he believed in God. And he said, of course not. God doesn't exist. Nothing does. Now, that is the Humean mentality. And it helps to explain to you why it is a mistake to call objectivism atheism. Objectivists are atheists. We deny the existence of God. But all sorts of people deny the existence of God, including Hume and the communists for different reasons. And therefore, to know that somebody is an atheist is to tell you nothing about the essence of his philosophy. It simply tells you that there is one aberration he did not commit, but that leaves open a terrific field. Now, on ethics, to say a word about Hume's view on that question, it should be obvious that his ethics is compatible with the rest of his philosophy. In other words, it is a thoroughly skeptical subjectivist ethics. The question he raises is, how can you ever defend an ethical or evaluative proposition? If we have to base everything on experience, experience only tells us what is the case. How do we ever get a knowledge of what ought to be the case? Did you ever touch a desirability? Did you ever smell a goodness? Obviously, valued terms you cannot grasp or imbibe through the senses or images. And if that is our only means of cognition, there is obviously no way to validate value premises. So here we have the old problem of deriving values from facts. And of course, Hume declares it can't be done. In fact, there's a parallel here. Just as he claims you can't get a must out of an is, you can't get a necessary connection out of a fact, so he says you can't get an evaluation out of an is. You can't get an ought out of it is. You can't get a value out of a fact. And therefore, value judgments are gratuitously arbitrary in their foundation. No rational ethics is possible. Ethics must begin with subjective desires and feelings, and when we say something is right or some equivalent value term, we ultimately must mean that is what we desire. Ethics is a matter of feeling. Reason, therefore, says Hume, is and must be a slave of the passions. In other words, we have, again, essentially the sophist viewpoint in ethics. Now, there's nothing new, therefore, in his ethics. It's the same skepticism as in the rest of his philosophy. And the answer to his specific charge that you cannot get values out of facts is contained, well, it's contained in Galt's speech, and it's also in the Objectivist Ethics, the essay by Miss Rand, so I won't comment on that further. To summarize Hume's philosophy, I think the best thing is to let him summarize it. This is a quote from him in which he expresses his arch skepticism. Quote, I'll read you these because they're famous and explicit. And because he's British, they're intelligible. Quote, "'Tis not solely in poetry and music we must follow our taste and sentiment, but likewise in philosophy. When I am convinced of any principle, 'tis only an idea which strikes more strongly upon me. When I give the preference to one set of arguments above another, I do nothing but decide from my feeling concerning the superiority of their influence. Objects have no discoverable connection together, nor is it from any other principle but custom operating upon the imagination that we can draw any inference from the appearance of one to the existence of another." Unquote. In other words, nobody can know anything. This is arch, complete skepticism, absolute bankruptcy, philosophy, idea, science, theory. It's all a matter of taste and feeling. Now you say you can't live by this philosophy, and you think that that is an objection to Hume. Well, you may or may not be surprised to know that Hume agrees with you. He says quite explicitly, no, you cannot live by this philosophy. He says in a famous passage, which I won't take the time to read, but what it amounts to is that he writes this material showing that external world is meaningless and self is meaningless and causality is meaningless and so on. Then he says he leaves his writing and he goes and dines with friends. He plays a game of backgammon. He uses that example. And he lives in the normal world with everybody else, and then he says he comes back and reads what he wrote, and it seems to him so strained and ridiculous he wants to throw it all out. But he can't find anything wrong with it. What is his solution to this dilemma? The solution, he says, is skepticism is a disease that comes from living by reason. And the only way out is simply pay no attention to the conclusions of reason. Quote, this skeptical doubt, both with respect to reason and the senses, is a malady which can never be radically cured, but must return upon us every moment, however we may chase it away. Carelessness and inattention alone can afford us any remedy. For this reason, I rely entirely upon them and take it for granted, whatever may be the reader's opinion at this present moment, that an hour hence he will be persuaded that there is both an external and internal world. You get the idea. In other words, you cannot live by philosophy. You have to be careless and inattentive to it because you can't live by reason. And you do not have to. Because we are not only rational creatures, we are also natural creatures, which means we have instincts, we have imaginations, we have feelings. And our feelings and imaginations and instincts will invent the fictions we need and will take us through life prosperously as long as we pay no attention to reason and philosophy. If you think you've got a reason for believing what you do, you haven't. The actual, I can't even say cause because there are no causes, but the actual something or other of your beliefs is simply instinct. Quote, famous line of Hume, if we believe that fire warms or water refreshes, 'tis only because it costs us too much pains to think otherwise. Unquote. Now, it's just a pragmatic matter of instinct. In other words, in the last analysis, irrational, unphilosophical, unthinking, blind instinct is superior to reason, thought, and philosophy. That's the final upshot of Hume's philosophy. Reason is impotent. Nobody can know anything. Reason can't give you a knowledge of reality. External reality is a myth. Entities are a myth. The self is a myth. Cause and effect is a myth. Logic is a subjective construction. Nobody has any reason to believe anything. You can live only if you ignore reason and function by irrational instinct. Only if you throw reason and philosophy into the fire and follow your irrational passions. Now you see, this is the end result of trying to philosophize, having invalidated the conceptual faculty. And one of two things had to happen at this point. Either a champion of reason in a valid sense had to appear, somebody who finally validated man's conceptual faculty, or the arch destroyer of all time would appear and put the final seal on man's philosophic demise. And the second, of course, is what happened. The man who came on the scene right after Hume, who set himself the task of answering Hume, who said he was going to avoid the floating constructs of the rationalists and the skepticism of the empiricists, that man was Kant. And of course, in the process of giving his answers to these schools, he once and for all removed reason from the philosophic scene altogether. We have now traced the story from Greece, beginning with Thales and his friends eagerly trying for the first time to probe into the nature of reality, and we have gone now all the way through David Hume, where the attempt finally collapses with a sickening whimper. For tonight, that's it. Thank you very much. And how could Hume ask, can we conceive the opposite of the law of cause and effect, since it is a conception and it would be meaningless to begin with? No. The answer is, by concept, he would mean form an image of. Can you form an image of the opposite of cause and effect? And he and his followers would say, yes, you could. You can form an image of an event without a cause, namely, for instance, the apple I mentioned during the lecture. And as long as you could image it, for them, that's forming a concept of it. How would Hume deal with 100% predictability? For instance, a certain mass of rock thrown with a certain force will always break a window made a certain way. Hume would say you have no way whatever of knowing this. All you would know is that up to now, that kind of rock has behaved this way, but you haven't got one reason in a million to believe that it's going to behave that way in the future. So he would simply say, I don't account for 100% predictability. There is no even 1% predictability. Of course, he's wrong, but that's what he would say. By Hume's premises, how can our past experiences cause us to form a habit and hence arrive at our false idea of cause? A good question. No answer to it. Hume throughout gives causal explanations, alleged causal explanations of our false beliefs, our belief in entities and the self and the external world and so on. Having denied causality, he has no business giving such explanations, a point which is commonly made in polemics against him. And therefore he has to say that our belief in causality, if he's consistent, like causality itself, is or like any phenomenon of the world, is simply an inexplicable, brute, unintelligible, contingent fact which he can't make a head or tail of. And in falling into the tendency to give a causal explanation of our mistaken belief in causality, he is using causality while denying it and thereby contradicting his own philosophy. If you asked Hume to put his hand, yes, in a fire a few times, and see if this would be the time his hand wouldn't be burned, would he do it? Assuming not, what would be his reason? Undoubtedly he wouldn't do it, and he would say because he's a creature of instinct. Being a creature of instinct, he is conditioned to expect irrationally that the flame would burn him, and he prefers to live by his irrational instinct. If Hume has to fall back on the concept of natural creatures with instincts, emotions, and so on, doesn't he necessarily refute his original empiricist premise of no innate ideas? If so, didn't he see this and offer any explanation? Well, you must understand that for Hume, instincts, emotions, etc., are part of the impressions we are directly given. Just as we are directly given the simple ideas, those include certain emotions, passions, and feelings, which for Hume do not derive from our ideas or from our intellect at all. They are simply irreducible primaries. They are part of our given empirical equipment, and therefore he feels no compulsion to offer any explanation of emotions. Emotions are simply there. Whatever emotions we have, and that's it. They are raw elements like sensations with no further explanation offered. Of course, since he offers no explanation of anything, it shouldn't surprise you that he offers no explanation of emotions either. Why did certain philosophers develop a preference for certain psychological processes, namely sensation and perceptions, which they held to be valid or meaningful, and reject as meaningless or non-existent other psychological processes such as conceptualization and understanding, whose existence are equally identifiable introspectively? Well, I tried to explain that in the process of giving the course. They believed that concepts were not based on reality, and therefore they simply reconstrued what is in fact available introspectively. If it'll make you feel better to think of that noise coming from the next room as simply a secondary quality and therefore is not really real. In other words, concepts do pose a certain problem that percepts don't. I'm not saying that the conclusions of philosophers are valid, but concepts are not directly perceivable in reality the way percepts are. Percepts represent a direct contact with reality. Concepts, an indirect contact. And therefore, if a philosopher says, yes, I can grasp perception, but I don't know what conception is, it represents, to be sure, a profound default on his philosophic task, since the essence of philosophy is the theory of concepts. But on the face of it, it is more intelligible, and if he were to say, I grasp concepts, but I deny percepts, because percepts are much simpler and easier to grasp. And in this sense, I would offer that as a partial explanation. But the full story is, of course, the whole nominalist argumentation.